ladies and gentlemen, and my dear friend Frank, welcome you all join us this webinar, AI and pandemic. And today we will 1 hour's speech, which is open to publics to participate online, and 1.5 hours for closed doors seminar. Before I go on, there is a short story which I would like to mention. Originally, we plan to host a bigger events on informational law and invite our speaker, Professor Pasquale, to Taiwan this spring. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19 outbreak and the border controls, we don't have no choice but to postpone it. We was thinking about to wait until the situation get better, but it doesn't seem to happen. So we must go on going on when we adapt our life to live with the COVID-19. That's why we will receive this to have this webinar. Now I will give a brief introduction to our speakers, Professor Frank Pasquale. Professor Pasquale is a famous information law scholar, and is best known for his coined the idea of social breakback social society. This is also the title of one book from him. And Professor Pasquale currently served as a professor of law at Berkeley's law school, and he is specialized, as we know, as artificial intelligence and law and legal economy. He also sits as chair of a subcommittee in USA, which is a quite long name. It's a subcommittee of privacy, confidentiality, or security, and the national community of vital and helps statistics and health and the human security. Yes, it's a long name. And Professor Pasquale today will talk about how the COVID-19 has not only changed our life and also brought us a great great challenge and so-called critical reflections, especially talk about how the features that COVID-19, the automations post COVID-19. Then I will pass the time to Professor Pasquale, and let's welcome Professor Pasquale.
Thank you. Great. Well, thank you so much for such a kind introduction. I deeply appreciate it. And I just wanted to be sure to share my screen of New Laws of Robotics and start from the, let's see, the slideshow. Sorry. Oops. Actually, let me try to share the PowerPoint. Sorry about that. One sec. Here we go. And then I will go from here into the slideshow function. Okay, I hope that works well for everyone. And so, great. So thanks so much to everyone who sponsored the event, to Academia Sinica. Thanks so much to attendees this morning, both attendees in person in the seminar and attendees online. This is my first book talk. I posted on Twitter as my pinned tweets the 12 book talks I'll be giving this fall. I'm so pleased to be starting in Taiwan at Academia Sinica, because in my past trips there, I have found that just my dialogue with professors at the Sinica, law and computer science other areas, has been incredibly instructive in working on this book. It was really exceptional to be able to go to a conference on artificial intelligence and law now 2 years ago. And that conference, we discussed things like autonomous vehicles, AI in the healthcare system, and I learned immensely from the Sinica perspective and from Taiwan's perspective. And I think it's, just to foreshadow my talk in the second half, it made sense to me that Taiwan would have one of the best records in responding to the coronavirus pandemic, based on how I was acquainted with the interplay between academics, experts and academics at universities like Academia Sinica, and government officials who are so open to expertise. And I think that one of the key ideas of this book is that human expertise is not to be discounted, that there are very important reasons to promote human expertise. And especially on the theme of today about post-COVID, I want to take on an approach, a theme to automation that has become very common after COVID, which is to say that because of pandemics, we have to do more and more things by machine. And I think that's true in many areas, but there are critical areas like governance, healthcare, pandemic response, and others, where we really do want to ensure a human role and a human in the loop. So I'm going to go through these different slides now. One of the things that I hope to do in this talk is to rebalance automation discourse. So from 2010 to at least 2018, there were many books essentially predicting a rise of robots, Life 3.0, a master algorithm that would take over the future of professions via a combination of machine, platform, and crowd. Okay, so I've tried to mash up all of those book titles on the left, because that was sort of the idea, was that we were going to have automation, artificial intelligence, and robotics do so much more, and particularly professional jobs that take postgraduate education, jobs in healthcare and other areas. And I think that the balance has to come in the idea that I promote, and that I believe Nicholas Carr, Lucy Suchman, Sophia Noble promote, that there is a balance between, and ideally a complementarity between AI and human beings. Okay, that ideally we design our computational systems to complement human labor and to make it more valuable in fields where that labor is a professional activity, is an activity that requires some degree of judgment, some degree of looking out for the public interest, and some education, right, beyond the usual level of education in society. And so that sort of is my effort to talk about the will robots take all the jobs question. It's to sort of promote this idea that there are going to be many areas where we want to preserve human judgment, and to lay out laws and political economy to let us do that. Okay? Now, I should start, though, by saying that there are some places where we want to promote artificial intelligence over intelligence augmentation. Okay, so for example, in farming, there's great opportunities to have machines do a lot of farming, right? In the U.S., part of President Trump's AI policy and you can see Trump sort of behind the wheel in this picture, is to try to promote self-driving vehicles. And I think that in transport and logistics, there's an argument for much more AI. But it's remarkable that even in the realm of self-driving vehicles, they always seem to be a few years off. And I think by the end of my talk, you'll have more of a sense of why self-driving vehicles always seem to be a few years off as opposed to coming up very soon. I also think in things like telecommunications, mining, these other areas. As I was writing the book, I was researching in Australia, some of the mines in Australia and the massive earth-moving machines they now use. And when I think about mining, I think about it as a useful job, an important job, but one ultimately that does not include the level of, at least at the level of getting the rocks, minerals out of the ground, that direct human interface with the earth does not include the level of professionalization that I see in some of the other fields where I want to preserve a more complementary role. So in these fields, I say let's prioritize artificial intelligence over intelligence augmentation, particularly after COVID, because if we think about after COVID, a lot of times we're seeing, particularly in places that have not dealt with the pandemic well, like most of the Americas except for Canada and most of Europe, there's a lot of worry that essentially workers in these fields are too close together, are transmitting the disease, et cetera. And so there's a much bigger argument there to automate more and to automate more of those fields as well after the pandemic, right? Of course, how long this will last, we don't know. But I think that we've got to acknowledge at the very least that post-pandemic, this type of automation could be helpful in preserving the resilience of supply chains, right? So the paradigm cases for rapid automation are things like manufacturing, logistics, transport, mining, agriculture, things like medical testing, if you think about COVID testing, other testing like that. And that's where I expect to see a lot of robots like this Baxter robot that you see in the assembly line here, taking on more and more important roles. The Baxter robot is essentially designed to watch a person for 8 hours and then just to do whatever that person has done. A certain number of hours, it watches you, then it does whatever you've done. So if you can be routinized, if what you do can be routinized via sensor networks that watch what you do, then that's a paradigm case for rapid automation. However, I think what's also critical is that medicine has some areas where we want to see rapid automation. And I, for example, in the book, talk a lot about cleaning, janitorial services, other services that you might want to have a robot involved because either it could handle more difficult to handle cleaning tasks, that it could be sent into more dangerous environments that we could send in a person. We also know that medicine can be helped if we have rapid machine learning driven pattern recognition. So that's another area where we really want to see advances in AI in medicine. But I do not believe anytime soon we will see even doctors like dermatologists or radiologists or anesthesiologists replaced by machine. I focus on those three because they seem from the outside to be the ones that are most like just pure pattern recognition, stimulus and response, right? And Johnson & Johnson marketed a machine called the Sedasys, Sedasys, that's sort of like sedation plus system, Sedasys, to do exactly that. But they've had a lot of difficulty because there are so many edge cases, there's so many judgment calls to be made, and people in general want to have the reassurance of a person behind the machine operation of something as vital as an anesthetist or something along those lines. I also found that as I interviewed surgeons who were complemented by robotic surgery apparatus, they were not worried about the robot taking over their job. They said the robot could watch them do surgery. The robot could help them in various ways. Like if you look at the way in which the cutting scalpel works in a robotic surgery device. It is much more precise and exact, and it can help avoid things like cutting a tendon unnecessarily or cutting a blood vessel unnecessarily. Those are wonderful advances in surgery. But to do it from beginning to end, doctors were very skeptical that one could do that. Okay? So I foresee technology complementing professionals rather than substituting for them in a field like medicine. Now I want to summarize my new laws of robotics overall. Okay, so this picture on the left is just of people in sort of these routinizable jobs just being told by the robots to go away. That the robots will be doing these jobs more effectively. But there are many places where this type of change is not inevitable or desirable. I think medicine is one of those places. And my 4 new laws of robotics are meant to help us identify where the type of replacement is good and where it is not so good, and where, when we deploy artificial intelligence, how we should deploy it. So my first new law of robotics is that we want intelligence augmentation as opposed to artificial intelligence when it comes to professions. I do think we have a rough and ready definition of professions right now, a sociology of professions, a list of things like medicine, law, journalism, education. There are other fields as well. That is a socially contested topic. And so what counts as a profession will be, I think, part of the future of labor policy. We will try to replace labor that is not a profession, and we will try to complement and increase the value of labor that is a profession. And that's going to be a huge political question for societies in coming decades. My second idea here is that robotics should not, and AI should not counterfeit humanity. Okay? And that's, I think, almost a subset of the first law. But one of the things I worry about is that there's great profits to be made by faking what I think are inevitably or quintessentially human qualities, right? Or just faking being a human. You see it in bots online, and I'm sure you've had debates about different bots interfering with election processes in the public sphere. You also see it in forms of affective computing, what's called affective computing, which are computer interfaces which are designed to make you react to the computer the way you would react to a human face or the face of an animal or something like that. And I think that that is a very dangerous form of counterfeiting, and that we have to sort of watch out for that as a way in which robotics and AI are overstepping the proper bounds of technology. Those first 2 laws of robotics are about positive deployments of AI and robotics. The second 2 are about when they become negative. And the first is promoting cooperation, that we don't want arms races, that, for example, when one side develops a killer robot, we don't want to encourage other sides to do that, or that just the development of it could cause an arms race. And finally, that robotics need attribution, that essentially if any robot or AI is put out into the world, it has to be identified as being controlled by a human person or persons as in the form of a corporation. That we cannot allow robots and AI to become autonomous individuals, just sort of set out in the world on their own, mainly because our legal system and our concepts of punishment and deterrence have been developed over hundreds of years with respect to persons, but we don't know how to deter robots yet. Okay? So that's the fourth law, ultimately, is something that is a deterrent against or a warning against even developing artificial general intelligence. The mainstream of AI ethics discourse often talks about artificial general intelligence as something that's inevitable, as then that we must regulate. I, in my new laws, say it's not inevitable and it's something that we should not develop. And that's just the part of the fourth law, is that attribution means that the AGI, or to any extent the AI, becomes more and more powerful. It is still always the responsibility of a person or corporation. In thinking about AI governance and algorithmic accountability, there's already a lot of discourse here in this area. There's governance of AI by things like NCVHS, NIST, the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, and the Department of Health and Human Services. But there's also governance by artificial intelligence. For example, in credit scoring, that's like a governance by artificial intelligence. And there are things like red light cameras, right? So if you might be speeding and you can automatically be given a fine. There are policing robots, there's security robots. There's one called the Night Scope that goes around and secures property. And I think that part of the future of AI and robotics regulation is thinking about when are we being governed by artificial intelligence, and how do we make sure that a human being is still in charge of that governance process. The next concept I wanted to bring in to sort of help us think about professionalization and about how medical AI and robotics as one field within robotics would be governed are these waves of algorithmic accountability. I have a blog post on the Law and Political Economy Project blog, a project out of Yale, on these two waves of algorithmic accountability. The first wave is to improve accuracy, fairness, safety, and efficacy in our current and developing technology. Okay? And that's going to be things like in machine learning in dermatology, learning healthcare systems. That's going to be very important. The second wave will be questioning certain trends in health technology, trends like comprehensive surveillance tools of nurses and doctors, automated therapy, and robotic caregiving. Okay? So I'll go through some of these in a bit. One of the very good recent books on AI in medicine is called Deep Medicine. And it mentions the possibility of dermatology databases that help dermatologists understand whether a mole or a skin abnormality is more likely to be a cancer or not a cancer. Okay? However, the problem with these databases is that many times they do not have a full representation of all groups in society. And so the worry becomes, what happens if a group is less represented and the AI does not help the doctor to find that group's skin abnormalities, and they might suffer cancer or death as a result. Under current malpractice law, in general, there will not be liability because it's simply seen as something helping the physician to do better. I believe that under future malpractice law, there should be standards of care raised over time, because this failure to include everyone is a deep failure of representation in our AI and machine learning, and we have an obligation to do better with that. That comes out of the US case called Thompson v. Nason and corporate negligence, which includes the idea of a duty to formulate, adopt, this is the bold portion, a duty to formulate, adopt, and enforce adequate rules and to ensure quality care for patients. I also want to talk about two types of robotics deployment in education and how after COVID, these might be increasingly popular. One, the Dragon Bot on the left is basically a cell phone screen put into a stuffed animal. And children are often asked by the cell phone screen to explain lessons to it or to help the Dragon Bot to do certain things. A lot of kids really like it. Another example of this is, say, having teachers being replaced by a robot, right? And that's particularly tempting post-COVID, right? Because the children have, on average, a much lower chance of a very bad outcome from COVID than human teachers do. One of the things that, is so fascinating after COVID is many people now are taking lessons online. I teach all of my courses online right now. And at the beginning of the pandemic in the US, people that like to disrupt education said, this is the future. Okay, this is going to be the future because we now know that we can deliver all this stuff online. However, the reception has been very negative. A lot of people say that and I'm sorry if I am exemplifying this right now, but a lot of people say that the Zoom meeting is difficult because the presence of absence is more tiring than the absence of presence. And so it's sort of that it brings a presence of absence. And so I think there will be many very difficult debates in our societies about to what extent will safety concerns in societies that can't get pandemics under control lead to rapid automation, right? And that's going to be a tough one. It's going to be a very difficult one. I mean, I think the simpler solution is to get the pandemic under control. However, there are many obstacles. Another example I wanted to give is AI in media and journalism. And so one of the things that is very troubling about media and journalism AI is that it has become a realm dominated by AI almost secretly, right? And if you look back to my book cover, the book cover for New Laws of Robotics has these little Space Invaders characters coming in that are extremely, of course, so they're sort of sneaky in the background. And I think that a lot of AI in media now, when we use Facebook for our news, when we use Google, YouTube to search for certain videos or to search for news or search for other things that you might use there, or in China with respect to WeChat and Weibo and other mediation mechanisms there, AI is really running the show. Algorithms are running the show. And also, even some of the content creators are algorithms like the bot on this slide. That I think is extremely problematic because they are substituting for journalists and editors rather than complementing them. And that's a violation of my first new law of robotics. Also, when they try to pretend they are real persons, it's a violation of my second new law of robotics. They are counterfeiting humanity. And I think that's really troubling. Fake content, you see this on Facebook a lot. There are lots of concerns. They don't really seem to be able to get a handle on it in many contexts. And they make things look the same. For example, this lie that was posted by President Trump's followers after the 2016 election saying that he had more votes than Hillary Clinton. In fact, she had more votes, but the Electoral College gave the election to him. And so these are lies, and essentially they are lies we should expect to happen when AI goes out of its proper bounds and replaces humans as opposed to complementing them. Really, a fact checker feature and other things like the Facebook Oversight Board aren't enough. One thing that I think is very good is that something called the Real Facebook Oversight Board was recently put together that would be able to take on such issues and objectively argue for something that would have more humans involved. So I think that in many areas, we have to restore human editors to things like Facebook and Google. Will they be less profitable? Sure. They'll definitely be less profitable, but they will essentially be taking on roles that are now being destroyed in many societies, which are editorial and journalistic roles that have been prematurely disrupted by AI and robotics. Now, to give a more general perspective here, why invest in health, education, journalism, arts, law, other human services professions? And we can talk about other professions as well. I think that the discussion, we should definitely think, what have I not listed, right? And what are some of the areas of human endeavor where should it be a profession or should it be something that we aim to replace by automation, right? Part of this is about a question of co-governance of technological diffusion. Doctors, nurses, teachers often face difficult conflicts of value, right? They might say, do we extend the patient's life or do we try to assure quality of life, right? This can happen with cancer treatment. Do you give someone aggressive chemotherapy or you decide to let them have a relatively painless last 6 months to 1 year to live? Same with respect to teaching. Teaching often has very difficult moments, right, where you have to decide how to attend to disruptive students or something like that for grade school teachers. I think we mark the importance of those decisions by saying that a human should be part of them, and that routinized or robotized approaches don't respect the dignity of the client, the patient, the student, and others, lots of others. And I would say the reader of the journalist, the reader of journalistic news, many other areas here. However, there are different views, right? Some people looking at artificial intelligence say that ultimately it is becoming a higher intelligence than ours. So that, for example, what Facebook decides to put in your news feed, what Google chooses for search results, even if it may not never be explainable. That's just a higher intelligence that we can understand it. It's like explaining Shakespeare to a dog. To explain what Facebook is doing to a human being would be like explaining Shakespeare to a dog. I don't share that point of view, right? I think that this is a very troubling sort of idea that AI is too much of a higher intelligence, but people are trying for it. And I'm sorry for how small this slide is, but this is part of Pedro Domingos's book, The Master Algorithm, which says that at some point in the future, machine learning and AI based on analogy, Bayesian analysis, evolutionary algorithms, connectionist models of the brain, and symbolic models will do all the thinking that we are capable of. In my book, I say, especially in the last chapter, that's impossible because our thought is inextricably intertwined with our bodies and our being human. So I do not think that like the brain or the mind is like software that you run on any hardware. I think that ultimately that these two things are inextricably intertwined. And in that way, my book does connect a metaphysics to a political economy. It takes a metaphysical stance. That's not common in this area, but I think it actually is important. And I think it's part of the reason why preserving human control in these vital fields is so important. When people say that all tasks are reducible to data patterns reproducible by machines, that really is an argument to put AI researchers in charge of the future development of healthcare, education, and these other fields. I disagree, and I think the basis for my disagreement really is in the Black Box Society book, which was translated in China in 2017. I'm hoping that the New Laws of Robotics book gets both traditional and simplified Mandarin translation at some point. But this in Black Box Society, I said this is really troubling, right? This is a troubling thing to sort of to say this because we need distributed expertise, okay? Cooperation between AI researchers and domain experts. Okay? But we also need to ensure that societies invest in productive AI rather than arms race inducing AI. So this is the second part of the book, which I'm going to have to go through relatively quickly. But it is what I've just gone over with in this talk is chapters 1 through 5, or 1 through 4, excuse me. Chapters 6 is very much about arms races and how to avoid them and how AI causes lots of arms races. So just to quickly go through it, lethal autonomous weapon systems can be viewed as a form of technology evolution. And this writer or researcher, Pedro Domingos, hypothesized a robotic park like Jurassic Park. I don't know if anyone's seen Jurassic Park, the movie, but he imagines a massive robot factory surrounded by a jungle, perhaps by ocean, and where robots would Darwinianly evolve to be the best killing machine. And I have a picture here of one of the robot battles. There's a TV show of robot battles where people try to design robots that can destroy one another in a small environment, right? And so the idea here is that you'd have a Darwinian evolution of technology. And he said he suggested it to the US Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and they said, yeah, that's feasible. We could do that. Okay. My main argument here is we should not do that. That's not a good thing because essentially these killer robots could easily escape from the island or the jungle they're on, much like the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, right? And that idea has led to abolitionists to say that we need to have an international ban on killer robots, that we all need to agree to this ban like we have a ban on blinding lasers and biological weapons. Okay? And these are scenes from the film Slaughterbots, where they imagine a slaughter arranged by killer robots. The problems for abolitionists, though, are that some forms of autonomous weaponry seem necessary or good, like defensive cyber warfare and other defensive capabilities. And the scholar Rebecca Krutoff has said there's no way to ban them categorically. Okay, so that's a problem because this is both under-inclusive and over-inclusive. Another threat is a self-reinforcing realist perspective where both, unfortunately, the US and China have sort of developed plans for unrestricted warfare, okay, and for ideas of arms races of surveillance, force multipliers of robotics, hacking or hijacking, and other forms of aggression, right? And I cite the book An Engine, Not a Camera, because I feel like these ideas of national self-defense are not based simply on models of AI and robotics, but essentially that the model itself shapes reality and becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So this is very dangerous. It's a very worrisome thing. The problems for the realist perspective, though, is that the arms race helps no one, okay? And that really we have to try to stop these arms races as best we can. I think probably the only way that we can do so, though, is with realism. And particularly, I'm inspired by Thomas Schelling's book Arms and Influence, which talks about the missile gap between the US and Russia. And sort of I devise in the book, I apply the theory of nuclear nonproliferation to the problem of killer robots and artificial intelligence arms races. So I essentially look at why did nuclear arms not proliferate beyond, say, 8 or 9 powers? There's many, many countries that could. Taiwan itself decided not to to develop a nuclear weapon in the 70s and 80s, or maybe in the 60s and 70s. And I think there's much to learn from those case studies, and I try to develop them in the book. The bottom line is that if you look at these top 15 countries for military expenditures, unfortunately, my country, the US, is doing sort of the worst here, right? It's sort of investing the most and in a way is sort of provoking arms races among others, but you could sort of see a fractal arms race among all these entities. All of the entities here are developing in some ways, are provoking others to develop the arms. And so the idea I have is that we ultimately need to have genuine multipolarity in the world by encouraging reduction in expenditures on the sort of destructive AI by, for example, promoting more spending in other areas. And so the idea here is that you make lethal autonomous weapon systems laws more costly via things like increasing liability for accidents, increasing reputational risk and cost, and ultimately leading states to reallocate more of their budgets toward complementary automation in productive areas like health, education, and human services. Our current path really is a place where, unfortunately, at least in the US, technocratic policymakers are trying to liquidate human services by automating them too quickly. But there's arms race automation in the military sector, and I try also show in the book, we don't have time in this book talk, but I show in the book problems in the finance sector as well, and automation there that is sort of an arms race. Both can be reversed. I think that ultimately what we need to do is develop a more nuanced view of cost and investment, following the economist William Balmo, who said that basically the cheapening of technologies generating pollution and destruction was a much greater threat than a cost disease in services. Okay, a lot of people complain about the cost disease in services, the idea that services get more expensive over time. Balmo said that instead the real problem was the cheapening of destructive and polluting technologies. And so therefore, my bottom line in this slide, the last 2 points, are that we need to have policies that get states to commit to productive, substitutive AI in non-professional sectors, like the sectors in mining, farming, logistics, transport, and some of those other areas I mentioned at the beginning, and to create productive complementary AI in labor-intensive professional sectors in the human services. So that sort of is the vision here. The vision is one of the. Now, I can imagine some objections, saying that there should perhaps be artisanal farms or other things like that would remain non-automated. There's a degrowthist view that might also object to this, to say that economic growth is not the most important thing and that we need to sort of focus on that. We can talk more about those in the Q&A, but I think ultimately my bottom line here is that this sort of idea about the productive substitutive AI and productive complementary AI is the key, in terms of trying to make sure that we both maximize economy's productive capacity, but also stably keep people in employment and in charge of the development of AI overall. So with that, I want to leave time for a discussion because I really want to hear your thoughts on this and questions. I know I went through a lot very quickly, so I'm very happy to go over any particular slides.
Did you mute your microphone?
Now it is.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I just ended. Yes, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much for your wonderful and inspiring speech, and you share your your current thoughts in your new books and the new law of robotics, and you list us reading your books already. So so we have about 10 minutes and Q&A. So I just open the floor, and if anyone some question or comment, and please before you speak and introduce yourself. And I introduce myself. I'm generally at Instituto Jurisprudencia. Okay. Now, anybody? have the question? No? Okay. I put
Thank you. That was very insightful, and I learned a lot. I'm not an expert in this area, so I have some questions that I hope. Oh, yes. Sorry. I'm an assistant professor at Taipei Medical University. My name is Chonglin Li, and so I noticed that you mentioned that in the future, in the post COVID-19 world, there's a need for disputed expertise between different professions. So I was wondering, how about the role of the society? How about the role of the public? How do they contribute to the conversation as well? As you mentioned, that in some areas there are a lot of conflict of interest, like in healthcare, when doctors, when they have to make a decision about end of care, there are a lot of values inside that judgment as well. So how do we engage as a society with the broader public? I ask this question because we are here mostly as professions, one way or the other. But I'm just wondering, like in a post COVID-19, how do we engage with the public? And also, how do we improve AI literacy as well? How do we improve people to recognize that it's the first time I hear about this idea about counterfeiting humanity. For me, that was very interesting, because how do we define humanity as well? What aspect of us that makes us human as well? So I was wondering, sorry, this is a lot of questions. So I was wondering whether you can elaborate on some of these as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That's excellent questions. I mean, very insightful questions. And I think that part of what I think is critical to the professional role is being able to engage people well on these issues. So, for example, there are clinical practice guidelines in medical practice that might lead a doctor to do a certain thing. They might say the guideline is that if you have a patient with these problems, you should do X, Y, and Z. There's also a concept of shared decision aids. And in the US Affordable Care Act of 2010, there's incentives for doctors to use a shared decision aid with patients. So if you use the shared decision aid, you can be more eligible for a higher level of reimbursement if you draw in the patient and you draw them in with these shared decision aids. And that would be on something like, say, back pain. You know, someone could either go to a physical therapist or they could get a surgery. There's a good book by T.R. Reid about someone going around the world and getting a different treatment everywhere that they went for their bad shoulder. And so you want to draw people in. I completely agree with you on that. And so I think that that's a really good point, and that ultimately part of the professional role is to draw people in and get them to sort of understand and buy into their own care. Yeah, and I think that the second point you made about counterfeiting humanity, it is a difficult one. I think that the easiest way for me to frame it, or the most direct problem I have with the counterfeiting, is, for example, I describe in the book something called Google Duplex. And what that is I could type on my computer, get me a restaurant reservation at 6 at a great restaurant or something, or a certain restaurant. Then it has an artificial intelligence call someone, not telling them it's an AI, that says, "Hi, I was just, calling about a certain restaurant reservation. Can I have this?" And I think that's really disrespectful to the person on the other end. But like ultimately, it should say any time that the AI is used, it should say, "Hi, this is an AI from Google. I want to. This is not a human voice. I want to make this this reservation." So that's sort of a straightforward one. But I ultimately think that even things like care are faked by a machine. I don't think that a machine can care, and that I know is more controversial. But I make a case in the book that if a robot comes up to you and sort of says, "I am your caregiver. I am caring for you," I think that actually is misleading because I think that cares ultimately only care if the person can walk away from it and choose not to care, but the machine has to care. It's programmed to do it. So I realize that's a difficult argument, but I mean, I do think that's one where we'll have a lot of more debates about. But that's where those two areas of either faking a human voice where there's not a human there, or faking a human face when there's not a human there, or faking certain quintessentially human characteristics are part of that. I also think, for example, if a robot says, "I feel pain," or simulates pain, I'm very doubtful about that, right? Because it could have been programmed not to have that response and not to have any of the internal indicia of the response. So, but that's in chapter 8 and chapter 2 of the book, and I lay out the less controversial stuff in chapter 2 because I think most people won't get all the way to chapter 8. No, just kidding. Yes, but any other questions?
Okay, so any question?
Hello, may I ask a question to Professor Pasquale?
Yes.
Hi, this is Rebecca Fan. I haven't seen you for a while.
Yes. Good. Thanks so much for calling in. Yes.
Oh, definitely. I do want to follow up on the point regarding co-governance, especially the point that you were just addressing regarding machine faking as human. In that regard, how do we talk about governance or even co-governance?
Right.
We could kind of dive into that a bit. Thanks.
Sure. So, I mean, I think that part of it is about there are very good case studies of caregivers using robots to help care for others. Okay, so I think that, for example, I mean, I could even give a picture of this if I can find it. I can't find it, but I have this. There are examples where there's a robotic seal called the Paro, and this is particularly a very interesting innovation in Japanese robotics. And the Paro just looks like a robotic seal, but it just sort of like bats its eye at an elderly person. It makes certain sounds to suggest that it needs care or that it likes being petted. And what's interesting about it is that if it's just given to someone with no other person, then there aren't as good responses as when nurses come and bring the Paro to the person and talk to them about it, or put a Paro with a group of people. So, I mean, I think that's part of it, is that if you try to develop like a caregiving robot, I think that's problematic in part because it involves like the company behind the robot basically deciding what's care. Whereas if you devise these robots to be used by professionals, be they nurses, home health aides, counselors, others, there are already studies that show better outcomes. And I cite the studies in my book about the better outcomes. One study was done in Norway and one was done in Taiwan, where they found better outcomes where people brought the robot to the elderly people that were sort of in a nursing home. So that's one element of it. I mean, I think the other co-governance and the fakery would be in media, right? So in media, right now, the big tech firms are doing a very bad job in the US. Unfortunately, I did not study whether there were fake accounts in China, because I think that basically, that when you think about big media platforms, you've got, the very largest ones I was looking at were Google and Facebook. I would love to see how smaller platforms operate. And part of my prescription in that chapter on media is that we may need to have smaller platforms overall. It may be that we just can't have the global public, or at least that people need to complement their consumption on something like Twitter, Facebook, Google, with smaller networks that are more accountable to people that one trusts, right? And I think that is one issue, but I think it's probably less of a problem in smaller countries than it is in very large countries where it's so easy for conspiracy theories and other things to be amplified. and for one company to fail to adequately moderate those and mediate between the audience and these conspiracy theories.
Hi, Frank.
Thanks. Yes.
I'm going to ask you the question regarding the first law of your new laws of robotics. It seems that you prefer weak AI over strong AI in professions, right? And the reason you propose is that because the profession always involve very difficult value judgments. But I'm wondering how you would respond to the challenges that maybe AI can also learn how human make value judgments, and in that case, would your first law still apply?
Yes. And I think that is a very challenging question, right? And it is ultimately the promise of a lot of these machine learning systems is the advance beyond expert systems in machine learning is just that we look at a huge amount of data about what you're doing, and we will just copy everything. We'll copy how you make value judgments, etc. Two responses to that. One would be that I think what's unique about my contribution as opposed to the usual philosophical or legal discussions is that I have a vision for a political economy. So my vision for political economy, in part, it's about keeping people in charge of the development of different professions, right? And it's about keeping people in charge of certain very important sectors, and not only keeping people in charge, but keeping a wide range of people who are distributed. Like one of the main ideas behind my black box book was that so much power in the US was being concentrated in Silicon Valley and New York City. And I live in New York City. I love New York City. It's fun to be here, but I don't think that every decision about where money goes to invest in American industry should be going through the five major banks, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and Wells Fargo here in the US in New York City, right? And I think similarly, what's my vision for AI here is that you have constantly people deciding on it. And I would make a similar analogy. I would say, I think that rather than contrasting strong and weak AI, I think that where I see a good analogy in what I develop in the book is drugs and doctors. For most prescription drugs, and maybe the prescription drugs are like strong AI and over-the-counter drugs are like weak AI, but for most prescription drugs, you can't just say, I want this drug and I just am going to get it from a pharmacist. A doctor has to say, yes, that's the right drug for you, right? And I think that's an area where I think that having, for example, teachers say, yes, that AI is good for the students. Or no, that AI, maybe you don't want to use that. Or I'll warn you about certain problems with that AI. That's a positive step forward. The last point I would make in this area is that I also intervene in the debate on universal basic income versus universal basic services. And so a lot of people say, we're going to have everything is going to get created by Silicon Valley. We're going to have fully automated luxury communism. It's all going to be created by Silicon Valley or by the largest tech firms in the world. They're going to produce things cheaper and cheaper. You'll buy everything off of Alibaba or Amazon or what have you. And then we just tax them, and then we take the taxes to give all of us money to buy the things, right? That's like a universal basic income story. I think instead, first, I don't think it's going to work because I think when you give people that money, their landlord's just going to charge them more for rent, right, or for houses. But secondly, I think that it's not going to work, and that what we really need to identify is what are the universal basic services that are important in our society, and to make sure that as many people as possible have some level of productive employment in them. Not necessarily 40 hours a week. It doesn't necessarily have to be 40 hours a week. Maybe it's going to be 15 or 20 hours a week eventually, but that we have as wide an array of people as possible who have some opportunity in these fields. Because what I think ultimately what we need to realize is that people's ability to control their lives is not just political, it's their role in their employment. And even, the person who may be seen as having the most subservient or subordinate role in a firm has some degree of power over some small aspect of their reality, right? and some small aspect of our common reality. And the worry I have, and that sort of is dramatically exemplified in E.M. Forster's book, our short story, The Machine Stops, is that we just cede all of those forms of power that we have distributed among people to automation and to centralized automation that in turn really reduces people's sense of efficacy and control and influence in the world that they occupy. So that I get also, I think that Russ Muirhead's book, Just Work, really gets to that idea. You know, that I think he has a powerful sort of tribute to that in his book. But I think that sort of is a broader idea that would be a justification, even if the AI could watch how I make all my value judgments and how you make all yours and how everybody makes all theirs, and sort of try to simulate what value judgments we would make.
So thank you very much. I think I would close this open seminar, and we will continue to the closed doors seminar. Okay.
Thank you. That's great.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Okay. And before we go on, I'm first to have to excuse myself to attend another meetings in a few moments. In this meeting will be very big controversial on the so-called COVID-19 mass testing.
Wow.
This is a big in the middle county in Taiwan. When
Wow.
this becomes a very heated issues, the people talk about if the authority or the research group could conduct this mass testing, and
Wow.
so I will be hosting this.
Oh, hello? If you can still hear me, thank you. That sounds like a very important meeting, and I hope it goes very well.
May I pass the role of the chair to Professor Liu? He will chair the next conversation. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So let's let's have a short break. Okay.
Thank you so much. Great.
Okay.